complicated, you know, man. Like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about it blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messing up.
All right, Luke Avery, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
Doing very well. Real pleasure to be here. Yeah, looking forward to chat.
Yeah, I'm glad to speak with you again. For those who weren't aware, I appeared on your channel, Lambda Bible Studies, to discuss a verse from Proverbs about 6 weeks ago. So if you guys are interested in anything we have to say, you should check that out. It was an interesting conversation, and you get to hear me talking instead of just kind of prompting a guest. So if that sounds interesting, you should definitely check that out. But for those who aren't familiar with who you are, Luke, and what you do, kind of describe yourself for the audience.
Yeah, I was just thinking, it must be funny to always be the person hosting the show and doing the interviews. But then I realized, that is also normally me. I run a YouTube channel called Lambda Bible Studies, and I have all sorts of interesting guests on talking about, usually we pick a chapter or a few verses from the Bible and just chew over it for an hour or so. And it's been really interesting to do the project over the last couple of years. People from a variety of Christian backgrounds and also a few people who aren't Christians at all. Each bringing interesting insights and perspectives onto God's word.
Yeah, I've enjoyed your interviews quite a lot. They're particularly interesting, and it's interesting as well, as I say that word 3 times in one sentence, to learn kind of a second side of some of the people on here, because a lot of people are members or are like particularly strong in their faith, but it isn't the primary thing they put out on the internet.
Right.
So I found that valuable.
So I think people who are Christians relish the opportunity to talk about it. It's enjoyable for me to get to see that other side of people as well. My audience, I'd like to think, is not entirely Christians as well. So as well as my interest being talking to Christians about the Bible, I'd love for people to watch my channel who aren't Christians and are interested, and they can learn more about the faith.
Well, and I think that the nice thing for me is that I personally am always hesitant to make proclamations on behalf of my faith in kind of a non-permissive environment, just because that's something that you should approach very, very carefully. And if you're speaking to a group of people who are either unconvinced or not even just, like unacquainted with faith whatsoever, there's always that in the back of your mind of like, I don't want to be the person who messes it up. And so having that kind of, to use, our enemy's word, that kind of safe space, I think is invaluable.
Yeah, I remember when I went to university, it was the first time I really tried talking to people about Christianity who might not be so familiar with it. And I felt this enormous pressure on my back. Like, what if I say the wrong thing? What if I misrepresent things? I think what you have to face is that everybody has to make mistakes in order to learn. It's like if you talk to paramedics and you realize, they have to learn, they have to be put into dangerous situations where their mistakes can really be costly. And sometimes they will make the wrong call at the moment, and that could cost somebody their life. But what are you going to do? You need to develop the next generation of paramedics. If you're hoping one day in your life to be an effective evangelist, somebody who takes the gospel out into the world, you've got to face that you're going to make mistakes along the way, say the wrong thing, and you will chew over those mistakes. But that's the process by which you become more effective. So I encourage people, if they do have those kind of insecurities, that actually there's probably a rightful, cautious feeling that they have, but put yourself out there and give it a go and accept that you will make mistakes, but that's how you will develop new skills and abilities.
So, Luke, I'm going to ask you the question I always ask every guest on this show on their first time, which is, how did you get here, right? Because this is kind of a weird corner of the internet.
Right.
And I'm always curious how people kind of find their way, down this rabbit hole.
Yes. So I'll give you a super quick history of my politics, I guess, which is when I was first able to vote, I looked at the options of candidates and I felt like the the only issue that really came to mind as something I cared about was that I felt it was immoral to have enormous personal debt. and, and therefore I felt on my behalf it was immoral for the country to develop an enormous debt. So I was looking for whichever party was going to offering to pay off the debt the quickest. And it's funny that was my starting point, and I've traveled a long way since then. But as you can imagine, from that starting point, I ended up pushing towards quite a libertarian, small state direction. I then, I guess I was quite interested in when Gamergate happened. So I followed people like Sargon back then. I guess that was 2000. What was that? 2009, 2010, that kind of time. And so when I then came across AA, probably through a Sargon stream, I was really interested in his Austrian economics videos. I watched them over and over and memorized the names of all the economists and all the little rules, because my brain was still largely working in terms of the way a state ought to work is to just be as small as possible. And by being small, it will allow all the people to live these beautiful, independent lives. But I've been on quite a journey since then, over the last probably 5 years, of realizing that actually the real base, the truths you have to understand about human nature mean that, for example, there is always an elite with an agenda. The people who rise to the top, who become the powerful, will inevitably try to push to increase their own power. So I guess I sort of learned that my libertarian dreams were as utopian as the Marxist dreams that I was used to criticizing. So yes, I don't know what I would call myself now, but I think I'm part of this general movement which is critical of modernity, critical of the cultural direction things are going. But now I also am cynical about the possibility of solving the problem by simply talking and persuading people about the the problems of the big state. So I suppose my fundamental hope is to see a spiritual regeneration in the West. Not that I have any particular expectations of seeing that happen, and if it doesn't, then I'm expecting sort of the inevitable coming of God's judgment on the civilization and the collapse of the West. But I think it's still our call. It's our responsibility to tell people, return to the worship of the true God. And if people do that, then there is still hope of renewal in a material way that would follow from the spiritual.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because it's a pretty common path, at least I think, through into our circles. And I think that instinct of just, well, leave me alone and I'll figure it out. I don't need you kind of coming in here to dictate it.
Mm-hmm.
That is very much an attitude that is kind of typical of specifically like dissenter Protestant,
Right.
Anglo-Saxons, right? And I say this
Yes.
as someone who is part of a religious tradition that was essentially didn't like how things were being run in Scotland and said, well, fine, we'll just go leave and go somewhere else. And the problem is it's like, well, that works when there's a massive continent, that you can just go off and do whatever you want. And there's no material way to actually tell you what to do, because when you're 100 miles away, you might as well be on another planet, because it takes us a month to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And so like, I have a great deal of sympathy for that vision. Like, I wish that's how it worked, and as someone who kind of came through a similar path of kind of like, small state, like old right libertarian Republican style of just like, well, leave me alone. Like,
Mm-hmm.
there is still a part of me that's like, I want that vision.
Yeah. The don't tread on me snake. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And again, it's not that it's a bad vision. I wish that's how things worked. But there's this kind of like uncomfortable realization that like, well, wait a minute, this kind of like non-enforced order, this order that arises just kind of spontaneously. You either need a very, very specific type of society to do that, which maybe has come and gone, or like Moldbug says, it's like, well, how do you get this kind of like spontaneous order? Well, you don't get it by pulling all the rules away. You get it by having someone so in charge, essentially, that this is the situation that occurs. Essentially, he describes it, and I can't remember exactly who he's talking to, but he describes, in one of his many letters to libertarians, where he's like, look, like, we share the same vision of an ideal society, but the problem is, just pulling out all of these constraints, knocking down every fence, saying that there's no force to be, put on people. Well, that doesn't get you there. That's like looking at your end state, and just saying, well, if we just act like that end state is already here, then it will be here, and that's not particularly, at least in my mind, like a useful way to go about it.
I think I would be more critical of the liberal dream than that. I always would have separated liberalism versus libertarianism, but not been very clear why the two terms seemed to be so mixed up. And I think actually they are more connected as ideologies than I would have been comfortable to realize. The issue is that we've been brought up in a society which heavily pushes the idea of freedom as our great virtue, and any society that can create the ability to coexist, it will surely be a happy place for everybody to live. But the trouble is that in reality, you want your state to be enforcing laws which are based on moral set of beliefs, and those there is no way to generate those in a completely universalist ideology. You can't just make a minimal set of moral commands that everybody agrees to, and keep increasing the diversity of the place. You will reduce the moral expectation of the citizens, and it will inevitably just lead to anarchy. And I think you see that pattern in the Bible, because you see in the book of Kings, which describes the falling apart morally of the state of Israel, there's this phrase that keeps coming up, and everybody did as they saw fit in their own eyes. And that's a phrase that's commenting on a society that is a horrible place to live. So although a lot of churches, I think, in the West have adopted a liberal concept of the society, I think it's kind of an infiltration of Christianity. We see it as a Christian idea because we think of the West as a Christian place, and we think of liberalism as a uniquely Western ideal, which perhaps it is. But I think it's a twisted version of. I would trace it that there's ideas that can make sense on an interpersonal scale that are pushed in the New Testament that then get like applied on a societal scale and then break. So as much as you can twist scripture to say lots of other horrible things, you can twist scripture to imply that we should advocate that God's moral laws should be ignored by our leaders for the state to allow anybody to do anything. And I think this was part one of a two-part plan, maybe not explicitly, but at least this is how it's functioned, whereby we had a Christian set of morals that we enforced through our laws. We scrubbed out the Christianity and made them sort of universal, quote unquote. And now we're tightening the screws with a new set of morals, the kind of progressive ideals that are anti-Christian. And I think all of the liberal ideas that we've all been, as Christians, supporting, because we've said, okay, we don't mind if we give up. Take same-sex marriage, right? Yeah, we'll allow anybody to marry whoever, because why should we enforce our beliefs on other people who live here? that's the way in which churches have kind of adopted this broad moral consensus. And then it's not going to be for much longer that we even hear those arguments anymore, because we are so much driving towards let's enforce the new morality through law. And so, yeah, I think we've been had start to finish, basically.
Actually, I completely agree with what you said. I meant a more limited point, which is just that
Sure.
the ideal of, spontaneous order, right? Which is the people acting virtuously and well without this kind of like authoritarian jackboot on their neck is a nice idea. It would be nice if that could occur. I actually completely agree with the fact that we have kind of been sold a false bill of goods. And there's this trap, right? This kind of like trap of, relevance, which is this idea that you can make a play, so to speak, to a wider audience. Like, oh, just compromise on this one thing, and you can substitute in your own mind what that one thing is. We'll say, okay, right, non-traditional marriage, right? We compromise on that, and the idea is, well, that's a popular thing that will make us popular. But to me, it's like the hidden wisdom in King of the Hill when where he says, well, you didn't make Christian rock didn't make Christianity cooler, it just made rock worse. And okay, maybe that's a little unfair, maybe that's punitive, but it is this kind of, people recognize that compromise, and they recognize that kind of deferral of moral authority. And once you've lost that moral authority, you can't really get it back. It's just,
people will say, well, a very common reaction to religion amongst normies is actually, I don't mind people having their own private religious beliefs, but I'm perfectly capable to form a moral system without it. In fact, we seem to arrive at the same conclusions. So I find it sort of irrelevant. All the religions are interchangeable. They all say the same thing, and they say the same thing as atheists. That's because the message has been broadcast from churches so loudly that we don't believe anything offensive. we are only offering the addition of Jesus, and then people listen to that and say, well, I'll take or leave Jesus, but you guys don't sound too bad, so we're not going to persecute you. And I think that's been a terrible strategy, given that the reality is that Christians do stand against a lot of the things that our society is driving towards, to the point where I think we should feel the responsibility to call our society to repentance, like I was saying before, in the grand fear of judgment that, the prophets of the Old Testament were using this very vibrant imagery to conjure to mind. It's like, we're going to terrify you because it's only fair that you know what's about to happen unless you change your ways. Whereas the tenor of the message coming out of churches at the moment is, oh yeah, we've got so much in common, man. You should just come along because we're actually pretty cool, and we do cool music, and we have people, trendy pastors up on stage with smoke machines or whatever. I don't think the church does a good job when it tries to compete against wider society on its USP. Like, church is not going to be the most entertaining place. It's not going to be the most feel-good place. But it is the only place that offers you a relationship with the creator of the universe. I'd argue that should be enough.
Right. It's interesting. I generally do not get into, social media arguments, but I kind of deliberately did, because I found someone who's kind of it was an artifact of a previous era, which essentially that I found seemingly undisturbed by the passage of time, a kind of, 2008 era new atheist, undisturbed in the wild.
Like,
I felt
the
like
Iceman.
Right. Yeah. I felt like I was Encino Man. I just I found this, this like primitive creature frozen in ice.
Hmm.
And so I kind of just gently poked at him to get a reaction, because I was curious, honestly, to see like, well, is this going to go how it always did? And of course it did. Maybe I'm
It was a
putting too
genuine
much.
specimen.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was, and it's science, so I had to run an experiment.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
what came up in the conversation is this idea that, at least from my perspective, and I realized I kind of came of age after the high watermark of new atheism. When I was kind of coming into my own, it was very much kind of after, and I remember first term Obama well, but for me, second term Obama is kind of when I started thinking about things. And that was the point when the kind of like secular liberal view was very much starting to show its age, and really starting to show that, like, wait a minute, guys, we haven't, like, even if we quote unquote won, like, why does it still suck?
Mm.
And so to me, it was interesting to see someone who was still totally and completely convinced by the fact that essentially, like, oh, the quote unquote the science of evolutionary biology or this or that will explain away this kind of like human need for worship. And to me, when I see is kind of like what is happening in the West, one of the major themes is essentially that we are watching a transition between one civic religion and the other.
Mm-hmm.
And the last civic religion was one that was, at least on like a lip service level, more friendly to kind of like lukewarm Christianity. It was essentially this idea that it's like, well, the state religion in the US, at least, of kind of like my grandparents' generation was, well, you go to a church, and you hear essentially like watered down moral precepts.
Mm-hmm.
And then, your saints, again, accepting this kind of tortured metaphor, are people like, well, it's George Washington because he was honest,
Yes.
or it was XYZ kind of like American figure. And we're
Mm-hmm.
seeing very explicitly kind of an iconoclasm and new figures being brought in their stead. And so on one hand, right, like if I had a choice between a society that lined up to my values 80% of the time and one that lined up to my values, 0% of the time, I'd probably pick 80. But nonetheless, what I think that we saw during that long period of time, and especially the kind of like moral and material decadence that followed, the Second World War, I realize it's slightly different in the UK than it was in the US,
Sure.
was that essentially it became easy and preferable to do that kind of trade you said of like, oh, well, like, do we really need to bother with the moorings of this? Well, we can just, mouth the platitudes. And we all know, like, we know it's not really true.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is like that works for a little bit, like you can make kind of and this is the example I always use, is making a photocopy, right? The first photocopy you make is, let's just say, 80% of what the original was.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the second time you photocopy that photocopy again, you lose a little bit more resolution. And I noticed this interacting with my grandparents and my father. My grandparents, who I love very dearly, are kind of the stereotypical, baby boomer evangelical conservatives.
Okay.
They love Ronald Reagan. They love Israel. They go to a big old Baptist church, and they're great people, right?
Mm.
But they lived like baby boomers, right? In both positive and negative ways. And my father, again, is very core Gen X.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is that my father is single, and hearing him talk about meeting women now, and he's a good looking guy, he's in shape, but he's like, I can't relate to these people. Their concepts of what is right and wrong is fundamentally different. And what's interesting is the way that he speaks about his parents' morality, which is kind of, and we'll just use sex and dating because it's a convenient one, is very much what you'd expect from baby boomers. It's like, all right, like, well, like you can sleep around a little bit, but like you should probably get married.
Yeah.
And whereas my father has the morality of 1994, which is like, well, within a committed relationship, it's fine. And now he's interacting with, millennials mostly. And he's like, well, what the hell? Like, this is completely different. And it's that process of once you've abandoned that substructure that seemed like disposable, seemed like something you could get away with, maybe it worked for you, but your kids make that same, they're using your morality and kind of photocopying your morality and getting less and less resolution with every kind of like step of the process, until, you kind of come to this point where it's like, well, that system just couldn't stand the degradation. There was so little left in it that we're seeing the birth of something that admittedly has a completely different set of precepts, but is much, much stricter. It's like a weird, like social pietism, that has kind of like taken hold among people my age. Do you see what I'm getting at there?
Yeah, I think you have to ask the question, what made the society great in the first place? And there's a model that I sometimes have in my head that I think is quite helpful. It's got a pretty strong explanatory power, maybe put it that way. So if you think of the disordered mass of humanity spread across the globe, and there's these kind of rippling, changing cultures. Every generation, things shift, and the local culture adapts, and just random mutations. At some point, one of those little tribes gets all of their ducks in a row, and they have something explosively powerful culturally, where the people are hardworking and they care for one another, and it's all ordered, and they produce children who are able to have a high photocopy accuracy in the way you were talking about, right? So not only is it strong, not only does it produce strong children, but their children are the same to a large degree. This means that tribe can blow up and take over the whole region, and if it's really powerful, it'll take over a continent. This is one explanation for where the new civilizations come from. Like, how come it was the Persians, and then the Greeks and the Romans, and what starts it? And one answer is it's this spark of enormous order. It's the coincidence of incredible everything lined up, and every generation there is a tendency for that order to sort of drain away, as you're describing, that you have quite a close copy of the pattern that made you successful in the first place, but it's just the process of entropy, even as we see it in thermodynamics, that as time passes, anything within this world breaks down and falls apart. And I almost wonder, to make this a theological idea, is that one of the aspects of our existence that we take for granted because we live in a post-fall world? Like, is this the effects of sin on our universe, that everything that man tries to make falls apart? You see this pattern all the way through Ecclesiastes. The rich man leaves an inheritance to his children, but within a generation or two, it's squandered, and there's this word that's like, it's vaporous. You can't grab onto it. It's like meaningless. And I think this is sort of also the lesson of the Tower of Babel, right? Everything that man tries to build has this impermanence, and therefore the lesson to us, because we observe this and we find it sort of disconcerting. We want to go back in time, but we can't seem to do it. We want to tell people what's wrong and stop this process of decay, but no one listens. And I think the proper response is to say, I'm going to build up treasure in heaven, right? I'm going to find a place that the moth doesn't destroy, the thieves don't break in and steal. Even though we seem to be living through this inevitable collapse, nonetheless, we can fix our eyes on this kind of eternal. So sorry if I've taken that on a bit of a tangent, but I think, in a sense, that process of bad photocopying is an ancient observation. It is something that has been talked about forever, that nations rise and fall. And we forget that we are part of history, right? It's not Fukuyama's end of history. We are just a small part watching the gradient of descent as our grand civilization that we are descended from falls into irrelevance in what will inevitably be extreme and painful way. And it's worth understanding the context, because it may change the paths of our lives, but it is unlikely that we can halt the decline. I don't think we should have our discussions with the preconception that we are. This is probably the change in my thinking from 5 years ago, right? I used to think these conversations are important because if we can properly understand and explain what's happening, people will listen to us and we can change the direction that things are going. And now it seems more of a we are on a ride that we can't control. It's like a roller coaster, and we can see the next bend, so we know how to brace. And we just the corner will feel less severe for us because we've properly braced for it.
I know what you mean, and that feeling of kind of powerful entropy is something that in fiction I've always found captivating. So Gene Wolfe has a series of very technically sci-fi novels about this. You know, they technically take place, you know, at a future date. But the thing that I found so powerful about them is that essentially our main characters are living in kind of this wreckage of a incredibly advanced human civilization that no one has any capacity to even understand. And so there are things that happen in the world that the author feels no need to explain, that are kind of on the level of, you know, what would be, you know, kind of like natural phenomenon for you and I, you know, things that are, you know, just like so completely incomprehensible. And I really enjoyed the book because it essentially is kind of and it's Gene Wolfe, what is the name of it? You could find it. It's his most famous work, but nonetheless, it's essentially the story of kind of our main character who is a medieval guildsman, you know, this kind of like feudal society. And that idea that essentially we could regress on not just a moral level, but on like a baseline level of technical competence is always something I found interesting. And there's a phrase that I believe it is the one of the original podcasters, Dan Carlin, used this phrase, kind of a run on the historical stock market, to basically describe, you know, the last, whatever, should we say, like 700 years of history, plus or minus, you know, and I realize everyone will have different dates on that, because there were multiple times in different civilizations where it was quite conceivable that you would see things that your ancestors made that no one understood the purpose of, no one could replicate. And I think that while our generations, and you and I, you know, are slightly different ages, but nonetheless, our generations are not morally special in the way that, you know, certain people of kind of like a progressive bent want to think that we are, you know, reaching this kind of like apotheosis of, you know, human progress. But we are kind of special in the sense that we are so far past the way that our grandparents and great grandparents lived on certain axes, not in every way. You know, human nature is a relative constant. And so in many ways, we're facing kind of a set of material conditions that we're not used to, you know, like really, right? If you're suffering a famine and it is, you know, 1450, and if you're suffering in a famine in 1100, even though there's a great deal of difference between those two times, it's a roughly analogous experience, right? You probably were a farmer, your ancestors were farmers. And so to a certain degree, I don't agree with, but I do understand why so many people feel like, well, what's the point in returning to, you know, this kind of like religious tradition? You know, what's this point in going back to something old? Because now we're living such radically different lives. And to me, that kind of like the core of that is, and this is one of those differences on our circles that I think is vitally important, which is what is your view on human nature? You know, do you view human nature as kind of this like, well, it's a mixed bag, you know, there's a lot of nasty things about us and we're probably pretty similar as far as humans go. You know, like you can't really, that kind of Christian concept of original sin, maybe you have a different name for it, but nonetheless, it's kind of vital. Or this kind of like Rousseauian idea that, oh, it's just like, if we could just fix society, we would fix man. If we could engineer the ideal society, we could fix man. And to me, that's kind of one of those things that it's like, I don't understand how, like, that is a bridge almost too wide to be crossed from a certain perspective. Do you see what I'm kind of poking around there?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the sort of Hobbes versus Rousseau split in some ways. Yeah, people. I think people see that. Some people see that as the most fundamental difference between the two types of thinking about what's going on in the world. I think it does affect your outlook because, in a sense, if you are a Rousseauian, your attitude to the suffering is to blame the time that you've been born. Like you wish that the decisions that had been made had gone a different way, or I don't know. There's almost something external, but in the human world that is broken, and therefore you go and fix it, and then you reach the utopia. And that, I think, leads to a lot of bitterness and a lot of feeling of like activism is the answer. Let's go on marches. You can see the Rousseauian influence on the behavior of college students. I would argue very clearly they're in a Rousseauian frame. The Hobbesian idea is more like everything good that we do have comes because of our ability to organize societies, and then you know, on the positive side, you have a feeling of gratitude towards the small mercies that you do see, but that can also lead to utopian thinking, because then you say, well, actually, if we can continue to improve things, if we can keep pushing in the same direction we've been going, things will get better. So I can see a progressive influence in that way as well. I think the reality is probably somewhere else. Like, we aren't necessarily living better lives because of our material improvements. And I think this is one of the things I've been trying to grapple with, is that we obviously are driven to eliminate poverty, right? It's very difficult to convince you. I'd argue, as a Christian, but even almost any human on the planet would agree that it's better if we can eliminate people who are dying from malnutrition and preventable diseases. Like these are clearly causes of enormous causes of suffering and deprivation. And it's only through the development of the progression of industrialization and the improvement of society, and these things are eliminating those kinds of terrible poverty conditions. However, if you actually ask somebody, if you pick a random person from a Western country, say you take a random American living in the heights of Western decadence, and then a random person from like a poor, say you take a South American country and pick a random person who's living on a fraction of the resources, I think you might find that the American is less happy. It's, despite the improvement in material conditions, there's this epidemic of different types of illnesses, like poor attitudes, what gets termed as mental health issues. So yeah, I just feel much more ambivalent towards a lot of the things that we're driven to care about. Like I don't think the most important thing in our lives is following the development of technology. I don't think the most important thing is eliminating global warming. I think the most important thing in our lives ought to be like the very local, small scale things that are happening around us, like caring for your family and your friends. But because of the internet making us a sort of global community, I like, one of the things that's really different about each generation is how they are less and less local in their interactions. Like, say, take TikTok, right? You're watching a new video every 30 seconds, potentially from a different person, from a random place, a random human who you'll never see again in your life, potentially, every 20 seconds. So your just pure experience of living is no longer about a small number of people who you have a close bond with, like a family, and it becomes instead about I'm just confronted with this mass of people who I don't know very well, and therefore I need to apply my vague concern to all of them and fix problems on the scale of the planet. And I think that's just a recipe for being hoodwinked and tricked into making actions which are doing no good whatsoever.
Yeah, and that's why I think that many people have likened, kind of whatever you want to call this, like weird syncretic progressive religion to, the Christian heresy of Gnosticism, right? This idea that you are not this kind of like fusion of body and soul, this kind of like a little bit lower than the angels, like, but still like, still made of the earth, right? That you're really and this is something that you see in kind of like the I'll call it the Reddit discourse, right? That's like, oh, you're just a ghost in the shell, you're just kind of puppeting this, this meat robot, is a phrase that you'll see come up. And that's, again, I would argue, kind of downstream of one of those things that it's almost like we never had when we were, attached to, a more traditional ethic, a more traditional religion. We never really had to justify that. It was just something that was kind of a buried premise, because if genuinely, like if you tried to explain, and I think about this often, like if you tried to explain to someone, my great grandmother's age, someone in their 90s, if you tried to explain to someone why the phrase, I am a man trapped in a woman's body, why that makes sense, quote unquote, like that is a completely different conception of reality, like, and you see this all the time. And I feel sympathy for older people who cannot wrap their heads around this, but it's that, we're kind of so far down and we're so many kind of like iterations, away from that core precept that, that idea that you really are just kind of like this disembodied being who can be kind of like shuffled around and edited based on kind of your will. And it reminds me very much of the kind of like Enlightenment Satan, Milton's Satan. And it was very trendy at the time to be like, oh, well, actually Satan's the good guy in Paradise Lost, kind of like the fedora tipping edgelords of the era,
right?
Or maybe a few generations later, but nonetheless, right? And it's because there's kind of like that buried idea of the will, right? That, like, it is this will to, never be trod on, like, again, the famous phrase, I would rather, rule in hell than serve in heaven. And it's never as explicit as that. But I think that the reason so many people are looking at specifically like trans ideology and seeing something kind of, satanic is that it is kind of this great crime against created order, right? It's that, no, I decide what I am and I will, inflict this kind of like great violence on my own form, right? On the way that God made me. I will do whatever I can to like break with the fabric of reality, to break with what, C.S. Lewis would call the Tao, this kind of like the order of the universe, so that I get what I want. And that's something that I very few, and admittedly, I have seen people who do affirmatively make that case. I'm sure you've seen the, Church of Satan, trans pride flags and all that. But I think in many people, it's not explicitly stated. And to kind of bring this long rambling thought to a close, to me, one of the kind of like fundamental, quote unquote, red pills of our circle is this idea that effectively most people don't make decisions in the same way that, a certain number of, shall we say, neurodivergent people do. These are oftentimes not really weighed as a pro or a con. Like, oh, I could be a Christian or an atheist. This idea that you are this kind of like blank slate who assigns themselves these modifiers. That's not true.
Yes.
The vast majority of people essentially just go along to get along. And to be honest, that was a really good strategy for the vast majority of situations, But the problem is now, so many people have essentially been handed broken tools, and not to say that, things were perfect in a different era, but the kind of like central road, the kind of like median position of society, whatever was like generally accepted morality, was at least a functional way to run your life. You know, it may not have been great. We maybe could have optimized it more or less. Maybe it wasn't exactly as devout as we'd like, but it was doable. You know, it was functional. And I think that that kind of like radical delocalization is very much that kind of like false bill of goods that you brought up at the beginning. This idea that, well, the way to happiness, the way to meaning in life is just endless personal choice. And it's the buried, at least in my mind, because as with anything in scripture, there are kind of multiple layers of truth to it. You know, there's kind of this like an immediate surface level, which we can't throw away. But there's this kind of like other philosophical level that is, especially in kind of like there's been an understandable, you know, fundamentalist reaction to the need to look for like complicated meanings, right? I understand that. That's not what I'm saying. But in that idea that you must, in order to live, you must die to yourself. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, to be honest, obviously there is a certain meaning in the sense of like eternal life. Like you must be willing to die if you want to have eternal life. But there's another part that it's like, well, you are going to have to kind of, to mix metaphors, to take something from writing, like you have to kill your children. You know, you have to kill the things that you like. You have to kill the things that kind of like activate your amygdala, you know, your lizard brain, the part of you that just wants to sit in the pod, you know, and look at, you know, whichever combination of stacked genitalia you prefer and make yourself whatever you want.
What a turn of phrase.
I think I stole that from somewhere, but I can't remember. But nonetheless, right? And if you do that, you do not become this kind of like enlightened, you know, modern day aristocrat. You become this like horrible, you become like Gorgias, and you become covered in sores, just constantly itching yourself, satisfying your urges. And so from a certain perspective, right, like I would prefer to live in a society that was upright and moral. But like, if you're looking to make an argument, it's never been easier. You know, you just look around and you're like, well, okay, like I'm not going to say I can offer you, you know, like what we said earlier about being relevant. I can't be more entertaining. I can't give you more serotonin. I can't give you more, you know, positive brain chemicals than the Skinner box can. You know, I can't compete with that. But not me, but you know, like what we can offer you meaning. You know, we can offer you a life that at the very least won't make you want to wake up and put a bullet in your brain. You know, which maybe that isn't the biggest bar to clear, but I think it's a hell of an advantage.
I think people know that there is something broken about their life that is just a deep instinctual gut reaction to existence. And then the question is, what's the best explanation for that? And there's sort of different options on the table. It partly depends who you are and where you're living. If you're female, you've always got the option of blaming the patriarchy. So people get very involved in that. So, you know, solve the gender crisis. And, you know, why do I feel unfulfilled in life? I wouldn't feel this way if I was a man. Same deal with if you're, you know, if you're black, you could decide, oh, well, it's presumably all of my problems are just caused because of racism. I think that a lot of the trans stuff is operating in that same kind of lens. It's people feel that they're messed up, and they also feel that has something to do with their inability to live a life that they would like, that they can see other people have, but they can, you know, either a man saying, I really want the life of that person who happens to be female. So maybe that's the reason that I feel so messed up, or vice versa. So then the solution maybe is, okay, well, I guess I just was born with this strange mental illness, or they wouldn't look at it that way. They'd say, I guess I was born in the wrong body, or whatever. You know, don't look too hard at the facts. Same with those other two that I mentioned, right? You don't actually want to introspect too hard about whether the points that the feminists are making make sense. It doesn't really matter, because all it is it's giving you enough of an explanation for the problems that you're feeling inside that you can just move on with your day and when you start feeling those bubbling up feelings of uncertainty, of doubt and pain and out of place, out of sorts, you can go and listen to a podcast with people who you agree, who are ranting about it, and you can kind of rant along with them and feel better. And partly the reason I frame it this way is because I think there is a risk within our circles that we could be doing a similar kind of activity where we can feel brokenness about something in our lives, and then we can just say, oh, well, the problem is the progressives. And actually, we'd listen to some people ranting about progressivism for a few hours, and then that's enough to distract us and we can get back on with our day. So I sort of phrase that partly as a question to myself as well of, are we fashioning our own fix to the same fundamental internal problem? Not to say that actually, I agree with most of the analysis that our little crew comes up with about the problems in the world, but I do wonder whether there's something else going on where even if we were in a society that was perfectly trad in all the ways that people would like to return to, or whatever it is, even if we had perfectly aligned gender expectations, and we were not pushing ridiculous economic policies, and we weren't trying to whatever issue is your hot button thing, the deep unsettling feeling that we have, I think, is much deeper than that. It is infecting everything. Like it's almost, I view it almost metaphysically interacting with every atom of the universe. Like there is a brokenness to the world that we live in. Romans 8 talks about the creation groaning, as in the pains of childbirth, but awaiting, like the childbirth will be the first fruits of the sons of God. Like it's kind of a it's kind of a deeply important and true reflection to say there is brokenness, and that brokenness has these symptoms that we can address, and that might be the brokenness is this progressive ideology at the moment. We can just stamp out the ideology. Great, that's good to do. But we have to understand that the true relief from this agitating feeling that we have will be in eternity, and we can only get there through the blood of Christ, not through sort of correcting the social policies or getting rid of the elites or whatever.
Well, actually, I completely agree with you, especially to one thing you said, which is that you have to wonder how many people are, discontent by nature, and how many people are discontent, because of real, material conditions. And I think it's a little column A, a little column B. I've said before that I'm kind of haunted by the specter of myself who was born maybe, 10 years earlier and became the world's most obnoxious, shit lib ever, that essentially just went down the anti-George Bush rabbit hole and never came back out. Which thankfully I'm not like that, but there's a part of me that's like, it's a real possibility.
That's funny. Do you keep that alternate reality in the back of your head and kind of check in with him?
I do. I have two distinct ones, and
Okay.
some of the people who've watched the show will know both of them. That's one of them, and the other one is becoming essentially the dissident right version of Dave Rubin. Someone who just has people on their show and adds absolutely nothing.
I agree.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
I agree. Well, that's interesting. I run a simulation a bit like that in the back of my brain, where I was just an unquestioning atheist, and I just hoover up all the evolutionary psychology explanations for why humanity is the way that it is. And there's a lot of self-consistency I think in that view, but I think it falls apart when you consider deep metaphysical questions about consciousness and things like that. So I like to think if I was as kind of deep thinking as I think I am in real life, that the alternative universe Luke would have eventually stumbled across. Materialism doesn't give you any explanation for objective morality. That doesn't feel believable. In fact, I'd argue I believe more deeply in objective morality than the literal observations of my eyes quite often. Like, I could be persuaded that there's an optical illusion more strongly than that there was a ethical illusion,
No, I do know what you mean, and I think that it's always hard to run a counterfactual like that, because at least when I think back on it, there are kind of like core precepts, some of which are religious, some of which are not, that I feel like I've kind of learned through like such an early or such a foundational moment in my life, that it's like, well, if that hadn't happened, you would be such a different person that it's almost not worth discussing.
Right.
And that kind of and I saw this in many ways, but I think that I really was a blessing being born when I was, because there was never really a time at which that seemed more attractive than kind of and I'm not like an optimally traditional person, but like, let's just say like a more traditional life, like at the point at which I was kind of, making those decisions, it was post Obergefell, the culture on American college campuses had changed, and this kind of like bacchanalian view of like, oh, it'll all be fine, do whatever you want and everything will turn out all right. It wasn't there, and that doesn't mean that no one went for it or that it's still an easy thing to do. But I'll put it this way, that there's kind of a narrative that was much easier to fall into in 1964. It's like, oh, we're going to do it. It's just a few years away, just a few $1 million away from John Lennon's Imagine. But I just remember, kind of like very much that kind of like early financial crisis, like Obama had just got in and that was the thing that was going to change everything. We're going to do it, guys. And nothing changed. And that's a really foundational moment for me, because I remember sitting like, oh, this isn't the way to do it. And maybe I didn't really like internalize that on a super, deep level at 8 or 9 years old. But looking back on it, that feeling of, wait a minute, we got to the goal. We're like the dog chasing the car. We got the car. Now what? And there was nothing changed. It was just kind of, we were there. And so that was and I don't mean to, just bloviate on my own personal experience, but that was one of those things that it was like, after that point, I think it would have been impossible for me to ever buy into current thing in the same way that some people did, just because it was like, I saw the big one, I saw this like, this like kind of like Western liberal messiah figure come in, who is going to clear out the temple of, the evil, warmongering, racist Christian rednecks, again, from their perspective. Right. And then we got it. We, whoever we was.
Sure.
And to me, that's one of those things that it's like that was a very foundational moment. And again, like, I think that these kind of like, these kind of like introspective scenarios you and I are running are essential to not, becoming kind of, self-obsessed and inwardly focused, this kind of like, okay, but for the grace of God, go I. But there is also something to be said for the fact that, like, I think that given a certain personality type and given kind of a certain, I guess, like, set of presuppositions, you would almost kind of, maybe not 100%, but land generally close to where you did, if that makes sense. And I realize this is a hypothetical, so there's no way to disprove me or prove my argument, but nonetheless.
Well, it's running along the lines of maybe the fundamental question about identity, like, what makes you? Is it your personality? Suppose you had a brain injury and you're politics changed and your personality changed, you know, you spoke a different language, which I don't think, I'm not convinced really does happen, but there's supposedly stories where it does. So like, how many things can change about you due to a brain injury, and yet it still fundamentally is you? And I guess the only you that matters is the you that actually currently exists. It's kind of you can ask these kinds of deep questions, but at the end of the day, you know, we have to make a conscious decision, I think, about who we are, and choose what we identify as. And I mean, the fact that these preference decisions have begun to be couched as identity, I think, shows the power of identitarian language. If you say, like, so if somebody says, I am gay, it's got a very different, it lands very differently to I prefer or enjoy this particular activity, right? Of gay sex. Like, you say, okay, one of them is about something deep and immutable, and one of them is something that is just a chance or just a fact about you amongst many, or a thing that could even be bad, something that you could try to dodge around. And I guess I think about my kind of philosophical conclusions that have only come about because of years and years of thinking and listening and reading, and I think, well, it seems really central to my identity that I have all this particular set of beliefs. Like I've I've certainly become known for believing these things in lots of contexts. That's kind of become a big part of who I am. But hey, if I had been, I don't know, if I'd have got married a lot younger and started having children, maybe I wouldn't have had the time to even look into and think about these things. And therefore, maybe I would be a woolly liberal. But then it would still be me in some way underneath all of that. In that case, I'm being less introspective because of a lack of time rather than a lack of inclination. So I think there's a lot of mystery there. We have to. I think we do have to have the humility to say, just because we've reached these conclusions that appear to match with truth, doesn't necessarily make us better than people who think differently to us, if they have been like too busy to spend the time to think it through. Like, I do think we need to have a bit of patience for people who hold the wrong opinions, because many of them are just caught up in the crossfire. If anything, the real enemies are the people, the real hardcore believers on the other side, right? the people who have devoted their lives to pushing an ideology, they're less excusable. And I'd like to think that, I obviously had an instinct that pushed me away from the mainstream, but then maybe I'm just a contrarian, you know? Do you ever feel that, like, I don't know if you'd consider yourself contrarian?
No, I think I definitely am. And I
Yeah.
notice it most in the kind of ridiculous, like, gut instincts I feel. Like, for instance, right, as kind of a joke, I went to see Avatar 2 right when it first came out with some friends, right? There's
Okay.
in small town America, malls are cursed places now. You know, the kind of like retail boom of the 80s and 90s is gone. But some insane individual has decided to buy this mall and put money into it. So now there is a bar at the mall, which my friends and I affectionately call Mall Bar. And the concept of drinking beers at the mall and then walking in to see Avatar 2 was kind of
Wow.
inherently amusing. And
Yeah.
as soon as I saw it, I was like, I'll go with the boys. But I know I'm going to hate it. Just
Yeah.
because it's popular. I know I'm going to hate it. And it turns
Yeah.
out I was right. But the fact that more and more people are like, oh, this is a revolutionary film, it changed my life, has just hardened my heart even more. Like, oh, it's popular, therefore it must be bad. No, I'm
Okay.
kind of making fun of myself for that. I
The
actually
question is, if you had gone to see it and thought, yeah, this movie is terrible, and then started hearing reviews from people saying, oh, it's terrible and it's not making any money and everyone agrees it's awful, would you have started to say, I don't know, it was actually, there was some really good bits about it?
That's probably an even more frightening counterfactual than the shitlib one, because I
Yeah,
don't
right.
know the answer.
The
Well,
Avatar, the alternative universe where you like Avatar is the most cursed
the most cursed of
path.
them all.
Yeah.
So anyway, Luke, we're coming up on time.
Oh,
So
yes.
where can people find you if they want to listen to more of your work?
Hey, well, if you search in YouTube Lambda Bible Studies, that's the channel I put the most effort into. I've got another channel called Lambda, and if it's Bible-related stuff, you go to Lambda Bible Studies. Anything else goes on Lambda. And I'm planning to do the same thing that I did last year around Easter, which is I ran a thing called Lambster. And I interviewed in the course of a week about 3 or 4 people a day from our spheres. So if you're interested in listening to me talk about stuff, but you don't want it to be Christian related particularly, then go and just search for Lambda and find the channel that's got my face on. Join the Discord as well, because there's a great little secretive community there that will be very welcoming to you if you pop along.
And I can say I've enjoyed your work, Lambda, quite a lot. Those links will be down in the description. As far as my stuff, guys, you know where to find me. The show's available on YouTube, also on Apple, Spotify, anywhere you listen to audio shows. We have a full new look for the channel upcoming, new thumbnails and everything. So, expect that. And also I've changed the way I monetize this show, where it is from now on, it's fully supported, from viewers like you. And I'm no longer, gating my backlog, behind a paywall. If you want it, it's there. It's staying up forever. It seemed like a good idea at first, but after more thought, I've decided to move away from that. And anyway, guys, expect a lot of episodes from me this week. I've got some time, and I'm really willing to put the work in. So we should have some interesting guests for you guys to listen to. And thanks for coming out. And remember, guys, the lie can't last forever. Good night.